The grocery bag slipped from David's hand, oranges rolling across the parking lot like scattered dreams, because there she was, Zara, 7 months later, and the curve of her belly told a story he thought had ended the night he walked away. The automatic doors of Fresh Mart whispered open as David stepped into the fluorescent-lit sanctuary of mundane routine. Tuesday evenings had become his refuge, late enough that the store was nearly empty, early enough that he could still pretend he had somewhere important to be afterward. He grabbed a cart, its wheel wobbling like his resolve these past 7 months. What do you think drives someone to choose the loneliest shopping hours? Have you ever found yourself avoiding places where memories live? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Aisle by aisle, David moved with mechanical precision. Cereal. Milk. The brand of coffee Zara used to say was too expensive but would steal sips of anyway when she thought he wasn't looking. His hand hovered over the bag before choosing the generic brand instead. Some habits needed breaking. 7 months. 213 days since he'd last heard her laugh. Since he'd last felt her fingers trace patterns on his chest while she talked about futures he was too scared to believe in. The night she told him about the pregnancy, her voice small and hopeful in the darkness of their bedroom, he'd felt the walls closing in. Not because he didn't love her, God, he loved her so much it physically hurt, but because love felt like a luxury he couldn't afford to give correctly. I need some time to think, he'd said, and even now the memory of how her face had crumpled made his chest tight. Time. As if love operated on a schedule. As if growing a human being could wait for him to figure out how to be worthy of the responsibility. He'd meant to come back the next day. Then a week. Then she'd stopped answering his calls, and pride mixed with shame until he convinced himself she was better off without him. After all, what did he know about being a father? His own had been a masterclass in what not to do. Across town, Zara pressed her palm against her lower back and surveyed the nursery she'd been setting up alone. 29 weeks pregnant, and she'd assembled a crib, painted accent walls in soft yellow, and learned more about baby gear than she'd ever wanted to know. Independence had become her armor, each accomplished task a small victory against the voice in her head that whispered she couldn't do this alone. The baby kicked, a sharp jab against her ribs that made her smile despite her exhaustion. I know, little one. Mama's tired too. She'd started talking to the baby around month 4, when the silence in the apartment became too heavy. Sometimes she imagined David's voice joining hers, reading bedtime stories or singing off-key lullabies like he used to do just to make her laugh. But those were dangerous thoughts. David had made his choice when she'd needed him most, and she'd made hers by keeping the pregnancy when he'd assumed she wouldn't. The abortion appointment he'd never asked about but had clearly expected. The conversation they'd never had because he disappeared before she could tell him that sitting in that clinic waiting room, she'd realized some decisions can't be unmade, and some love is stronger than fear. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Maya. Need anything from the store? I'm making a grocery run. Zara glanced at her empty refrigerator and the list on her counter. She could ask Maya to pick up the essentials, but lately, she'd been feeling trapped by everyone's helpfulness, however well-meaning. 29 and pregnant didn't make her invalid, just bigger and more tired than usual. I've got it, thanks. Need the exercise anyway, she typed back, ignoring Maya's immediate response about overdoing it. The evening air carried the first hint of autumn as Zara walked the 3 blocks to Fresh Mart, her hand unconsciously cradling her belly. This baby had been a surprise, but not an unwelcome one. She'd always imagined herself as a mother someday, just not alone. Not with the father of her child treating their love like something to be escaped from rather than embraced. She grabbed a cart, grateful for something to lean on, and made her way inside. The store was blissfully quiet, just the way she preferred it these days. Fewer stares at her obvious single motherhood, fewer well-meaning strangers asking invasive questions about the baby's father. David was reaching for pasta sauce when he heard it, a laugh that used to be his favorite sound in the world, now cut short as if the person remembered they had no reason to be happy. His hand froze on the jar. It couldn't be. Not here. Not now. But when he turned around, there she was. Zara stood in the next aisle, her profile unmistakable even though everything about her had changed. Her hair was shorter, framing her face in soft curls he'd never seen before. She wore a flowing dress that couldn't quite hide the pronounced curve of her belly. Their baby, still growing, still becoming. The grocery bag slipped from his hand. The sound of oranges hitting concrete echoed through the parking lot like gunshots. David watched them roll away, each one carrying a piece of his composure with it. But he couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't do anything but stare at the impossible sight of Zara, very pregnant, very real, very much not having had the abortion he convinced himself was inevitable. She turned at the sound, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly, and their eyes met across 20 feet of grocery store fluorescence and 7 months of silence. Time didn't stop, it shattered. Zara's face cycled through emotions like a slideshow of their entire relationship. Shock. Recognition. A flicker of the old warmth that used to light up when she saw him. Then the wall slammed down, her expression hardening into something he'd never seen before, protective fury mixed with bone-deep hurt. Zara. Her name fell from his lips like a prayer he'd forgotten how to say. She didn't respond. Just stood there, one hand on her cart, the other cradling the curve where their child was growing. The child he'd run from. The child she'd clearly chosen to keep despite his cowardice. David forced his feet to move, leaving his scattered groceries behind. Each step toward her felt like walking through quicksand, every muscle in his body screaming that he didn't deserve to be in the same space as her. But he couldn't stop. 7 months of regret and sleepless nights pulled him forward like gravity. You're. He gestured helplessly at her belly, his voice cracking on words that felt too small for the magnitude of what he was seeing. Pregnant. Zara's voice was steady, but David caught the slight tremor underneath. Yes. I am. The conversation he'd imagined having with her 1,000 times in his head evaporated. All his practiced apologies, his explanations, his desperate justifications, gone. Because seeing her like this, seeing the evidence of his abandonment written in the curve of her body and the defensive set of her shoulders, made every word he'd planned to say sound pathetic. I thought. He started, then stopped. What had he thought? That she'd handle it? That she'd make the decision that would let him off the hook? That 7 months later, they could run into each other and pretend that night never happened? Have you ever had a moment where reality completely shattered your assumptions? When you realized you'd been telling yourself a story that wasn't true? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. You thought what, David? Zara's voice cut through his mental spiral. That I'd just take care of it? Make your little crisis disappear so you could sleep better at night. The bitterness in her voice hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't the Zara who used to curl up against his chest and whisper her dreams into his skin. This was a woman he'd created through his own cowardice. Harder, sharper, alone. That's not. I never said. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she'd once found endearing but now seemed to irritate her further. You didn't have to say anything. Zara's laugh was hollow. You said everything when you walked out. When you stopped returning my calls. When you disappeared like I was some kind of problem to be solved instead of the woman you claimed to love. The word love hung between them like a bridge that had been burned but somehow still cast shadows. David wanted to tell her that he'd never stopped loving her, that walking away had been about his own fears and inadequacies, not about her. But looking at her now, strong, beautiful, carrying their child with a dignity he'd never deserved, he realized his reasons didn't matter. His intentions didn't matter. Only his actions did. And his actions had spoken louder than any declaration of love ever could. How far along? He whispered, though he could probably do the math himself. 7.5 months. Each word was deliberate, calculated to land with maximum impact. Due in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Their baby would be here in 6 weeks, and he'd missed almost the entire pregnancy. The appointments, the first kick, the ultrasounds, the late-night cravings, the fears and excitement and planning. All of it. She'd done it all alone because he'd been too scared to stay. Zara, I don't. She held up her hand, and he noticed she was no longer wearing the ring he'd given her for their first anniversary. The absence of it felt like another orange rolling away from him, another piece of what they'd been scattered and irretrievable. Don't you dare stand there and try to explain yourself. Not here. Not now. But David couldn't stop the words from coming. 7 months of guilt and regret had to go somewhere. I was scared, okay? I was terrified and I handled it all wrong, and I know I don't deserve. You're right. Zara's voice was quiet now, which somehow hurt worse than her anger. You don't deserve anything from me. Not explanations, not forgiveness, and definitely not a place in this baby's life. The finality in her voice made his chest tight. This baby is mine too. Something flashed in Zara's eyes, dangerous and protective and fierce. This baby, she said, her hand moving to fully cover her belly, is mine. I'm the one who held my hair back during morning sickness. I'm the one who cried alone at the first ultrasound because you weren't there. I'm the one who painted the nursery and bought the crib and learned how to be everything this child needs because their father decided we were too much trouble. Each word was a scalpel, precise and devastating. David felt something break inside his chest, something that had been cracked since the night he walked away but was only now fully shattering. I made a mistake, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The biggest mistake of my life. A mistake. Zara repeated the word like it tasted bitter. Is that what you call it? Walking away from the woman you loved and the child you created? A mistake. She started to push her cart past him. Done with the conversation, done with him. But as she moved, David caught a scent that nearly brought him to his knees. Her perfume, the same one she'd worn since they first started dating, mixed with something new. Something warm and maternal and heartbreaking. Please, he said, reaching out instinctively. Zara stopped, looked down at his outstretched hand, then back up at his face. For just a moment, her mask slipped, and he saw the woman he'd fallen in love with. Vulnerable. Hopeful despite herself. Still carrying love she probably wished she could forget. Then the moment passed. Please what, David? Her voice was tired now, worn thin by months of doing everything alone. Please forgive you. Please let you back into a life you chose to leave. Please pretend that seeing you here doesn't make me want to scream and cry and hate myself for still. She stopped herself, the unfinished sentence hanging between them like a lifeline he was too afraid to grab. Still what? He whispered. But Zara was already walking away, her hand protective on her belly, carrying their child and his heart with her toward the exit. David stood there among his scattered oranges, watching the automatic doors swallow the woman he loved and the future he'd thrown away, knowing that this moment, this terrible, beautiful, devastating moment, had changed everything. Again. David stood frozen in the produce section for a full 3 minutes after Zara disappeared through the automatic doors. Other shoppers navigated around him like he was just another obstacle, their cart's wheels squeaking over the oranges he'd dropped. The normalcy of it all felt obscene. How could the world keep spinning when his had just been knocked completely off its axis? He forced himself to move, mechanically gathering the scattered fruit with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. 7.5 months pregnant. 6 weeks until their baby arrived. Their baby. The reality of it hit him in waves, each one threatening to pull him under. By the time he made it to his car, his phone was already buzzing with texts from his brother Marcus. No, he corrected himself, from his brother Jerome. You look like hell, man. Everything okay? David stared at the message, wondering how Jerome could possibly know, before remembering he'd promised to stop by his brother's place after grocery shopping. He'd completely forgotten, just like he'd forgotten how to breathe properly, how to think in straight lines, how to exist in a world where Zara was having his baby without him. Can't make it tonight. Something came up. Jerome's response was immediate. Woman trouble? If only it were that simple. David typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on something like that. He drove home on autopilot, his mind replaying every second of their encounter. The way Zara's face had changed when she saw him. The protective way she'd covered her belly. The exhaustion in her voice when she'd said, "Please what, David?" Like she was tired of hoping for things that would never come. But underneath her anger and hurt, he'd seen something else. A flicker of the woman who used to trace his scars and tell him they made him beautiful. The woman who'd cried when he told her about his father, not out of pity but out of love so fierce it had scared him. She'd almost said something. Still. Still what? Still loved him? Still thought about him? Still wished things had been different? David slammed his apartment door behind him and immediately regretted it. The sound echoed through the space he'd kept exactly the same for 7 months, like a museum exhibit of their relationship. Her favorite mug still sat in the cabinet. Her book was still folded open on the nightstand where she'd left it. He told himself he was too busy to pack her things, but the truth was he couldn't bear to erase the evidence that she'd once belonged here. He pulled out his phone, her number still programmed under my heart red heart hash like a teenager who'd never learned how to let go. His finger hovered over the call button. What would he even say? That seeing her pregnant had made him realize what an idiot he'd been? That he'd spent 7 months missing her so badly it felt like a physical wound? That every day without her had been a masterclass in regret? But she'd made herself clear. This baby was hers. Not theirs. Hers. Because he'd forfeited his right to be part of this miracle the night he'd walked out instead of staying to fight for their future. He set the phone down and reached for a beer instead. Zara made it exactly halfway to her car before the tears started. Not the gentle, manageable tears she'd become accustomed to during pregnancy hormone surges, but the ugly, body-shaking sobs that came from a place so deep she'd forgotten it existed. She stood there in the parking lot, one hand gripping her car keys, the other pressed against her belly where the baby was kicking frantically, as if responding to her emotional storm. "It's okay, little one," she whispered through her tears. "Mama's okay. We okay." But they weren't okay. Seeing David had cracked something open inside her that she'd worked so hard to seal shut. For 7 months, she'd built a life without him. A good life. She had a nursery ready, supportive friends and family, a solid plan for single motherhood. She'd convinced herself that she didn't need him, that she was better off without someone who would run when things got difficult. So why did seeing him look so broken make her want to comfort him? Why do we sometimes want to heal the people who hurt us most? Have you ever found yourself caring for someone who walked away from you? Share your thoughts below. I think we've all been there. Zara fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking from adrenaline and pregnancy-induced low blood sugar. She needed to get home, needed to eat something, needed to call Maya and vent about this cosmic joke of running into David at the exact moment when she was feeling most vulnerable about doing this alone. But as she drove, her mind betrayed her by replaying not just tonight's encounter, but the good memories she'd worked so hard to suppress. David bringing her soup when she had the flu, staying up all night to hold her hair back and rub her temples. David learning to cook her grandmother's jollof rice recipe, burning it 3 times before getting it right just to see her smile. David whispering "I love you" into her hair when he thought she was asleep, like the words were too precious to say out loud. David running. That was the memory that mattered. Not the sweet moments or the promises or the way he used to look at her like she was something miraculous. The memory that mattered was the one where she told him they were going to be parents and watched him shut down in real time, watched him retreat behind walls she couldn't scale. "I need some time to think." Time. As if love was something that needed to be scheduled, planned, approved by committee. As if the baby growing inside her was going to pause its development while he figured out whether he was ready to be a father. By the time Zara reached her apartment, she'd cycled through anger and hurt and was settling into something more dangerous: hope. Because despite everything, despite the way he'd abandoned her when she needed him most, seeing him tonight had reminded her that she'd loved him for a reason. Multiple reasons. The way he'd looked at her belly, not with disgust or resentment, but with wonder and something that looked like longing. The way he'd said her name like a prayer. The way he'd reached for her at the end, instinctive and desperate. But hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not when she had a baby coming in 6 weeks and a life she'd carefully constructed to not need David Martinez in it. Her phone rang as she was unlocking her door. "Maya, of course. Don't you hey girl me?" Maya's voice was sharp with worry. "Jerome just texted me that David looked like he'd seen a ghost and cancelled their plans tonight. Please tell me you did not run into that man." Zara closed her eyes and leaned against her door. Of course Jerome would text Maya. Their siblings had maintained a careful friendship throughout the breakup, walking the diplomatic tightrope of loving both David and Zara without taking sides. "I ran into that man," Zara admitted. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "Maya. I'm getting in my car." "No, Maya, don't. Girl, you are 7.5 months pregnant and just saw the man who broke your heart while you're carrying his baby. I'm coming over with ice cream and tissues and possibly a baseball bat, depending on how this conversation goes." Despite everything, Zara smiled. "I don't need you to come over." Need and want are 2 different things. What did he say? How did he look? Did he see the belly? Please tell me you at least made him grovel a little bit. Zara sank onto her couch, suddenly exhausted. "He dropped his groceries when he saw me. Oranges went everywhere." "Good. I hope they were expensive oranges." Maya's fierce loyalty was exactly what Zara needed right now. What else? "He looked." Zara paused, trying to find the right words. "Broken. Like he's been as miserable as I have, which makes no sense because he's the one who left." "Misery loves company, but that doesn't mean you have to provide it," Maya said firmly. "He made his choice, Zara. You don't owe him anything just because he's finally realizing what he threw away." But that was the problem, wasn't it? Part of her, a part she didn't want to acknowledge, wanted to owe him something. Wanted to believe that the love they'd shared had been real enough to survive his moment of cowardice. Wanted to think that maybe, just maybe, people could change. He asked how far along I am, Zara said quietly. And you told him it's none of his business, right? I told him 6 weeks left. Maya's sigh was audible through the phone. Oh, honey. What are you thinking? That was exactly the problem. Zara wasn't thinking at all. She was feeling, and feeling was dangerous when it came to David. Feeling was what had gotten her pregnant and alone in the first place. I'm thinking, Zara said slowly, that I need to forget this ever happened and focus on getting ready for this baby. Alone. Like I've been doing. Good. That's good. Forget David Martinez exists. But even as Zara agreed with her sister, even as she promised to put tonight behind her and move forward with her carefully constructed life, she knew it was already too late. Because seeing David tonight hadn't just reminded her that she'd loved him. It had reminded her that she still did. 3 days passed in a haze of determined normalcy. Zara threw herself into nesting mode with the intensity of someone trying to outrun her own thoughts. She organized the baby's closet by size and season, assembled the changing table she'd been putting off, and deep-cleaned baseboards that didn't need cleaning. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind off the way David had said her name like he was drowning and she was air. Maya had taken to checking in every few hours, as if monitoring her sister for signs of David-induced weakness. Jerome, bless him, had apparently been doing the same thing with David, which meant both siblings were walking around like emotional landmines waiting for the slightest provocation to explode. It was Thursday evening when Zara's carefully constructed avoidance strategy crumbled. She was leaving her 30-week prenatal appointment, Dr. Williams' reassuring words about the baby's healthy development still echoing in her ears, when her car decided to stage a rebellion. The engine turned over once, twice, then nothing but a clicking sound that her father had taught her meant expensive problems. Come on, she whispered, trying the ignition again. Not today. Please not today. But the universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor about timing. Zara called Maya first, voicemail. Then her father, at work and couldn't leave for at least 2 hours. Her insurance company's roadside assistants had a 90-minute wait time, and sitting in a medical building parking lot while 7.5 months pregnant felt like a special kind of torture. She was scrolling through her contacts, wondering if she was desperate enough to call her ex-co-worker's cousin who sometimes did mechanic work on the side, when someone tapped on her passenger window. David stood there looking uncertain and concerned, car keys dangling from his finger. Zara's first instinct was to pretend she hadn't seen him, but ignoring someone standing 3 feet away required a level of delusion she wasn't quite desperate enough to embrace yet. She rolled down the window halfway. What are you doing here? Physical therapy, he said, pointing to the medical building behind them. Shoulder injury from work. I saw you sitting here and... He trailed off, taking in her frustrated expression and the phone still pressed to her ear. Car trouble. The automatic I'm fine was on her lips, but then the baby kicked hard enough to make her wince, and the reality of her situation crashed over her. She was pregnant, stranded, and running low on options. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. It won't start, she admitted reluctantly. David's expression shifted immediately from cautious to concerned. Pop the hood. Let me take a look. You don't have to. Zara. Her name was gentle but firm. Pop the hood. Against her better judgment, she did. Have you ever had to accept help from the last person you wanted to be vulnerable in front of? Sometimes our pride and our needs are in direct conflict. What would you have done in Zara's situation? Let me know in the comments. David disappeared from view, and she could hear him moving around the front of the car, muttering the kind of automotive observations that had once been endearing and now felt dangerously familiar. He'd always been good with his hands. Could fix almost anything if you gave him time and the right tools. It was one of the things she'd loved about him, his quiet competence, the way he approached problems with patience instead of panic. 5 minutes later, he was back at her window, wiping his hands on a paper towel. Your battery's dead, but that's not the real problem. Looks like your alternator's going out. It's been slowly draining power for weeks, probably. Zara's heart sank. How much is that going to cost? More than you want to spend 6 weeks before the baby comes, David said softly. But the good news is it's not dangerous to drive short distances if we can get it jump-started. The bad news is once you turn it off, you'll be stuck again until you get it fixed. They stared at each other through the half-open window, both understanding the implications. She needed to get home, needed to get groceries, needed to function like a normal adult preparing for a baby. But her car was essentially a very expensive paperweight until she could afford a repair that would probably cost more than she had in her emergency fund. "I can give you a ride," David offered quietly. "No. Zara, be reasonable. You're 30 weeks pregnant and stranded in a parking lot. Let me help." I said no. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew how hollow they sounded. What was her alternative? Call an expensive rideshare service every time she needed to leave her apartment? Ask Maya to rearrange her entire life to play chauffeur for the next 6 weeks? "I can call someone else," she said, but her contact list felt painfully short suddenly. Most of her friends worked during the day, and the ones who didn't lived across town. David was quiet for a long moment, and she could practically see him weighing his words. "What if we jumpstart it now so you can get home? And then, what if I help you look for a used car this weekend? Something reliable but affordable." The offer was so practical and thoughtful that it made her chest tight. This was the David she'd fallen in love with, the one who solved problems instead of running from them, who thought 3 steps ahead, who wanted to take care of the people he loved. But that same David had walked out on her when she'd needed him most. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you want to help me?" David was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because it's my baby too, and even if you don't want me in your life, I need to know you're both safe." Something cracked in Zara's chest. Not broken, she was already broken, but shifted, like a fault line settling after an earthquake. "This doesn't mean anything," she said finally. "You helping me. It doesn't change what happened or what you did or anything." "I know. And it doesn't mean I forgive you." "I know that too." Zara closed her eyes and felt the baby settle into a more comfortable position, as if even her unborn child was tired of the tension. When she opened them again, David was still standing there, patient and hopeful and heartbreakingly familiar. "I need to get home," she said. "Okay. Let me get my jumper cables." 20 minutes later, Zara's car was running again, David's sedan following behind her like a protective shadow as she made the careful drive home. She kept glancing in her rearview mirror, part of her expecting him to disappear like he had 7 months ago. But he stayed there, turn signal matching hers, hazard lights ready if she needed to pull over. When they reached her apartment complex, David parked behind her and approached her window again. "It should be fine for tonight," he said. "But don't turn it off unless you absolutely have to. And if it dies again, call me. Please." He handed her a piece of paper with his number written on it, and Zara realized she deleted his contact information months ago in a fit of post-breakup clarity. Seeing his handwriting, the same careful print he'd used to leave her love notes on the bathroom mirror, made her throat tight. "About this weekend," she started, then stopped. Accepting a ride home was one thing. Spending a Saturday car shopping with a man who'd abandoned her was something else entirely. "No pressure," David said quickly. I know how much you hate dealing with car salesmen, and I thought maybe having someone there who knows about engines might help. But if you'd rather handle it yourself." "I can't afford much," Zara interrupted. The admission felt like another small surrender. "The baby stuff has been expensive, and maternity leave means I'm already stretching my budget." Something flickered across David's face. Guilt, regret, determination. "We'll find something good. I promise." The casual use of "we" hung between them like a bridge neither of them had planned to build. "This is just practical," Zara said, as much to herself as to him. "Just solving a problem." "Just solving a problem," David agreed. But as Zara watched him drive away, she knew they were both lying. Because there was nothing just about the way her heart had sped up when he'd offered to help, or the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious and fragile, or the way they'd fallen into their old rhythm of him anticipating her needs before she voiced them. In her apartment, Zara put David's phone number on her refrigerator and told herself it was only for emergencies. She didn't admit, even to herself, that seeing him again was starting to feel like the emergency she'd been avoiding all along. Saturday morning arrived grey and drizzly, the kind of weather that made Zara want to stay in bed with tea and old movies. But her dead car sat in the parking lot like a reminder that real life didn't pause for pregnancy fatigue or emotional complexity, so she found herself waiting by her window at exactly 9 a.m., watching for David's familiar sedan. He was 3 minutes early, which was so typically him that it made her chest ache. Always punctual, always prepared, always thinking ahead, except for the one time it had mattered most. The ride to the first dealership was awkward in the way that only conversations between people who'd once shared everything could be. They talked about safe topics, the weather, her prenatal appointments, his physical therapy, while carefully navigating around the landmines of their shared history. "How's the shoulder?" Zara asked as David winced slightly while turning the steering wheel. "Getting better. Tore my rotator cuff at a construction site about 3 months ago." He paused, then added quietly, "Threw myself into work after, well, took on too many overtime shifts, wasn't being careful enough." The admission hung between them like a confession. "After I left you. After I destroyed everything good in my life. After I proved I was exactly the kind of man I swore I'd never become." Zara wanted to ask more. Was he okay financially? Had he been taking care of himself? Was he as miserable as she'd been? But those weren't her questions to ask anymore. The first dealership was a bust. The cars in her price range were either held together by prayer and duct tape or had so many miles they'd practically circumnavigated the globe. David was polite but firm with the salesman, asking pointed questions about maintenance records and pointing out problems Zara would never have noticed. "You know a lot about cars," she said as they walked away from a particularly pushy salesman hawking a sedan with suspicious rust spots. "My dad taught me." David's voice was carefully neutral. One of the few useful things he passed down before he took off. It was the first time he'd mentioned his father voluntarily in, maybe ever. In 2 years of dating, Zara had learned that David's dad had left when he was 12, but David had always changed the subject whenever she tried to ask for details. "You never really told me about him," she said carefully. David was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he wasn't sure he wanted to swallow. "Not much to say. He was there, then he wasn't. Left my mom with 2 kids and a mortgage she couldn't afford." They were walking toward the next dealership, but David's pace had slowed. "The night before he left, I heard them fighting about money. About responsibility. About how he never signed up for all this." Zara's breath caught. The parallel was too obvious to ignore, too painful to examine directly. "David." "I was 12, he continued, like he hadn't heard her. "Old enough to understand that sometimes people just break under pressure. Old enough to promise myself I'd never put someone in that position." They'd stopped walking entirely now, standing in the drizzle between 2 car lots while David finally said the words that had been living in the space between them for 7 months. "When you told me about the baby, all I could hear was his voice. I never signed up for this. Like loving someone was supposed to come with a guarantee that life wouldn't get complicated." David's laugh was bitter. "So I ran, just like he did. Proved that I was exactly the man I swore I'd never become." Zara felt tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks. "You're not your father." "Aren't I?" David turned to look at her fully for the first time that morning. "I left you when you needed me most. I abandoned my child before it was even born. I convinced myself I was protecting you from my inability to handle responsibility, but really I was just protecting myself from the possibility of failing you." The raw honesty in his voice cracked something open in Zara's chest. For 7 months, she'd imagined a dozen different reasons why David had left. That he didn't love her enough. That he didn't want the baby. That he'd found someone else or decided she wasn't worth the effort. She'd never imagined that he'd left because he loved her too much to risk hurting her the way his father had hurt his family. Sometimes the reasons people leave have nothing to do with us and everything to do with their own fears. Have you ever realized that someone's behavior was about their past trauma, not your worth? It can change everything about how we see a situation. Share your thoughts below. "You should have told me," she whispered. "You should have trusted me enough to let me help you work through it." "I know." David's voice was thick with regret. "I know that now. But at the time, all I could think about was this image I had of you 5 years from now, stuck with a man who couldn't handle pressure, who might walk out when things got harder. Better to break your heart once than to break it slowly over years of me disappointing you." Zara Marie Thompson, do not hang up this phone. Do not let that man back into your heart just because he's finally acting like a decent human being. You've built a good life without him. Don't throw it away for. "I'm not throwing anything away," Zara interrupted. I don't know what I'm doing, okay? But I have to figure it out myself." After she hung up, Zara sat in her new car for a moment, breathing in the scent of unfamiliar upholstery and air freshener. Through her windshield, she could see David still waiting, patient as ever. The old David would have been checking his phone, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. This David just sat quietly, like he had all the time in the world for her to make whatever decision she needed to make. Finally, she got out and walked to his window. "Thank you," she said. "For today. For the car. For everything. You don't have to thank me." David rolled down his window but didn't get out, maintaining careful distance. "I should have been doing this all along." Have you ever had someone show up for you in a way that felt both too late and exactly on time? Sometimes people grow into the person we needed them to be, just not when we needed them to be it. What do you think? Is timing everything, or can love transcend it? Let me know in the comments. Do you want to come up? The words escaped before Zara could stop them. "I could make coffee. Or tea. I have that herbal stuff you used to like." David's eyes widened slightly. "Are you sure?" No, she wasn't sure about anything. But she was tired of sitting in parking lots having conversations through car windows, tired of treating the father of her child like a stranger she couldn't quite trust herself around. "Just coffee," she said. "Don't read anything into it." But as they walked toward her building, David carefully matching his pace to hers, Zara knew they were both reading everything into it. Her apartment felt smaller with David in it, like his presence expanded to fill spaces she'd forgotten existed. He stood uncertainly in her living room, taking in the changes she'd made, new curtains, rearranged furniture, photographs where their couple pictures used to hang. "It looks good," he said. "Peaceful." "I needed peaceful." Zara moved around her kitchen, grateful for something to do with her hands. Pregnancy makes you crave calm environments, apparently. "How has it been?" "The pregnancy, I mean. Really?" The question was careful, like he was afraid the answer might break him. Zara poured water into the kettle and considered her words. "Hard," she said finally. "Beautiful but hard. The first trimester was rough, morning sickness that lasted all day. And being alone for all the appointments, all the decisions." She trailed off, not wanting to hurt him but needing him to understand the cost of his absence. "I'm sorry." David's voice was thick with guilt. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. The baby's healthy, though." Zara's hand moved automatically to her belly. Strong heartbeat, growing right on schedule. "Dr. Williams says everything looks perfect." "Dr. Williams?" "My OB. She's amazing, really calm and reassuring. I was terrified at first, you know? Having a baby is scary enough without doing it alone." David was quiet for a long moment. "What's the baby like? I mean, does it move a lot? Do you know if it's a boy or girl?" Something in his voice, wistful and careful and heartbreakingly hopeful, made Zara's chest tight. He wanted to know. Not because he felt obligated to ask, but because he genuinely wanted to understand this person they'd created together. "I don't know the sex yet. I wanted to wait." She paused, then added, "I thought maybe, well, I wanted some surprises left, I guess." "And the movement?" "Oh, this kid is active." As if summoned by the conversation, the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick. Zara winced and pressed her hand to her side. "Are you okay?" David was beside her instantly, his hand hovering over hers like he wanted to help but wasn't sure he was allowed to touch. "Just a strong kick. Right under my ribs." She looked up at him, standing so close she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with rain. Do you want to feel?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither of them had expected to build. "Can I?" David's voice was barely a whisper. Instead of answering, Zara took his hand and placed it gently on the curve of her belly where the baby was moving. For a moment, nothing happened, and she worried the baby had decided to be shy. But then came a strong, unmistakable kick against David's palm. His breath caught audibly. "Oh my God." "Strong, right? Dr. Williams says that's a good sign. Means the baby's developing well." But David wasn't listening to medical reassurances. He was staring at her belly with wonder and something that looked like reverence, his hand still pressed gently against the spot where their child was making its presence known. "That's our baby," he whispered. "That's our baby," Zara confirmed. For several minutes, they stood there in her kitchen while the kettle heated and the baby performed for its father, David's face cycling through emotions too complex to name. Joy and regret and love and grief all tangled together. "I can't believe I missed so much of this," he said finally. "You don't have to miss the rest of it." The words were out before Zara could stop them, and they both froze. She hadn't meant to say it, hadn't meant to offer him a door back into their lives. But watching him discover his child for the first time, seeing the pure love in his expression, she realized that some truths were bigger than hurt feelings. "Zara." David's voice was careful, like he was afraid to hope. "I don't know what it means yet," she said quickly. "But this baby deserves to know their father. And you deserve to be part of this, if you can promise me you won't run again." "I won't run." The words were immediate and fierce. "I swear to you, I will never run again. Whatever happens between us, whatever we figure out or don't figure out, I will be here for this baby. For both of you." The kettle whistled, breaking the tension, but David's hand stayed on her belly where the baby continued its gentle movements. For the first time in 7 months, Zara allowed herself to imagine what it might look like if they figured out how to be a family. Not the family they'd planned before fear tore them apart, but something new built on harder-won trust and deeper understanding. "The baby likes you," she said softly. "How can you tell?" "Because usually when strangers try to touch my belly, the baby goes completely still. Like it's hiding. But it's showing off for you." David's smile was radiant and heartbreaking. "Smart kid. Already knows how to make an impression. Gets that from you. You always were good at charming your way into people's hearts." "Not always," David said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "I charmed my way right out of the most important heart I'd ever found." The truth of it settled between them like a challenge. Could hearts that had been broken be trusted again? Could love that had survived separation survive the harder work of staying together? Zara didn't know. But for the first time in months, she was willing to find out. For 2 weeks, they existed in a careful bubble of possibility. David came by every few days, always with a reason, always respectful of boundaries. He fixed her leaky kitchen faucet, helped her move the heavy boxes she'd been putting off organizing, and sat through an entire episode of the pregnancy reality show she'd become obsessed with without once commenting on how ridiculous it was. They talked about safe things, the baby's development, her doctor's appointments, his physical therapy progress. They danced around the edges of deeper conversations, both afraid to push too hard on something that felt fragile as spun glass. Zara told herself it wasn't forgiveness, just practical cooperation for their child's sake. But when David brought her favorite Chinese takeout after a particularly difficult day at work, or when he remembered she liked extra fortune cookies, her heart betrayed her with little flutters of the old happiness. Maya watched these developments with sisterly suspicion, but she kept her opinions to herself after Zara snapped at her for commenting that David was laying it on pretty thick with the reformed boyfriend act. Even Jerome seemed cautiously optimistic when he mentioned that David had been sleeping better and had actually started talking about the future instead of just surviving day to day. Everything changed on a Thursday evening when Zara was 32 weeks along. She was expecting David for their weekly grocery run, a routine they'd fallen into after her car had needed minor repairs and he'd insisted on helping until she felt comfortable driving the Honda in all conditions. But instead of his familiar knock, she heard raised voices in the hallway outside her apartment. "Told you she doesn't want to see you." David's voice, tense and protective. "And I told you that what my daughter wants isn't really the issue here, is it?" Zara's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice, though she hadn't heard it in over a year. Robert Thompson, her father, sounded exactly as self-righteous and controlling as he had the last time they'd spoken. She opened the door to find David standing in her hallway, shoulders squared defensively, facing down her father. Robert looked exactly the same, silver-haired and imposing in his expensive suit, carrying himself with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Daddy." The word came out smaller than she'd intended. Robert's expression softened marginally when he saw her, though his eyes went immediately to her very pregnant belly. "Zara, you look, well. What are you doing here?" She stepped closer to David instinctively, and didn't miss the way her father's jaw tightened at the gesture. "Maya told me about your situation," Robert said, his tone suggesting that pregnancy was some kind of unfortunate medical condition. "I came to see if you'd come to your senses yet." "My senses?" Zara's voice rose. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Robert said, his gaze flicking dismissively to David, "that I'm prepared to take care of this problem. There are still options, even this late. And afterward, you can come home and we can pretend this whole mess never happened." The words hit Zara like physical blows. This whole mess? You're talking about your grandchild. I'm talking about a mistake that's about to ruin your life, Robert said coldly. You're 32 weeks pregnant with the child of a man who abandoned you. Do you have any idea how this looks? What people are saying? Have you ever had someone reduce the most important thing in your life to an embarrassment or inconvenience? Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us most can be the cruelest when we don't live up to their expectations. How do you handle family members who can't accept your choices? Share your thoughts below. I don't care what people are saying, Zara said, but her voice was shaking. This baby is wanted. This baby is loved. By him. Robert's laugh was bitter as he gestured toward David. The same man who walked out on you the moment things got difficult? What makes you think he won't do it again? David stepped forward, his voice carefully controlled. Mr. Thompson, I understand why you're angry. You understand nothing, Robert cut him off. You're a construction worker who got my daughter pregnant and then disappeared. You have no business being around her now, and you certainly have no business playing house and pretending you're going to be a father. He is going to be a father, Zara said fiercely. Whether you approve or not. Really? Robert's smile was cruel. And how exactly is he going to support a child on a construction worker's salary? How are either of you going to manage when reality sets in and you realize that love doesn't pay for diapers and childcare and medical bills? We'll figure it out, Zara said, but even as the words left her mouth, she heard how naive they sounded. Will you? Because from where I stand, it looks like you're setting yourself up for disappointment again. Robert's voice turned almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. Sweetheart, you're a smart woman. You have a degree, a career, a future. Don't throw it all away because you're afraid to make the hard choice. The hard choice. Zara's voice was barely a whisper. There are couples who would pay handsomely for a healthy baby. Good families who can provide everything this child deserves. You could still salvage your life, find someone worthy of you, start over properly. The silence that followed was deafening. Zara felt the world tilt sideways as her father's words sank in. He wasn't just suggesting she give up the baby. He was suggesting she give up David, give up the family they were trying to build, give up everything she'd been hoping for these past few weeks. And the worst part was the tiny voice in her head that whispered he might be right. David's face had gone white. You want her to give away our child. I want her to be realistic about her options, Robert said. She's 30 years old, unmarried, and partnered with a man who's already proven he's unreliable. This baby deserves better than struggling parents who can barely take care of themselves. You don't know anything about what this baby deserves. David's voice was rising now, his careful control finally cracking. You don't know anything about us or what we're capable of. Don't I? Robert's smile was sharp. Let me tell you what I know about you, David. I know you walked out on my daughter when she needed you most. I know you work construction because you didn't finish college. I know your father abandoned his family, and statistics show that pattern tends to repeat. So tell me, what exactly do you bring to this equation besides good intentions? Each word was calculated to wound, and Zara could see them hitting their mark. David's shoulders sagged slightly, and she recognized the expression on his face. It was the same one he'd worn the night he told her about his father, shame and fear and the terrible certainty that he wasn't good enough. David, she said softly, reaching for his hand. But he pulled away, and that small gesture felt like a chasm opening between them. Maybe he's right, David said quietly. Maybe you deserve better than what I can give you. Don't, Zara whispered. Don't you dare listen to him. But what if he's not wrong? David's voice was broken. What if I can't provide for you the way you deserve? What if I mess this up the way I messed up before? You won't. How do you know? The question was desperate, like he was begging her to convince him of something he couldn't convince himself of. How do you know I won't let you down again when things get hard? When money gets tight, when the baby's crying all night, when you realize you could have had a better life with someone else? Robert watched this exchange with satisfaction, like a chess player who'd just achieved checkmate. You see, he said to Zara. Even he knows I'm right. You're both too young, too unprepared, too unstable to raise a child. But it's not too late to make the smart choice. Zara looked between the two men, her father, cold and manipulative and absolutely certain of his righteousness, and David, the man she loved, crumbling under the weight of doubts her father had weaponized against him. "Get out," she said to her father. "Zara. Get out of my home. Now." Her voice was steady, but tears were streaming down her cheeks. "You don't get to come here and tell me my child is a mistake. You don't get to manipulate David's fears to serve your agenda. And you don't get to pretend this is about what's best for me when it's really about your reputation." Robert's face hardened. "I'm trying to save you from a life of struggling and disappointment. You're trying to save yourself from having a grandchild you're embarrassed of," Zara shot back. "Well, congratulations. You won't have to worry about it. Because this baby and I want nothing to do with someone who thinks love is something to be ashamed of." "Fine," Robert said, adjusting his cuffs with cold precision. "But when this all falls apart, and it will fall apart, don't come crying to me for help." He walked away without another word, leaving Zara and David standing in her doorway, both of them reeling from the wreckage he'd left behind. "David," Zara started, but he was already shaking his head. "What if he's right?" David whispered. "What if I can't give you what you need? What if our baby deserves more than I can provide?" "David, look at me." But when he raised his eyes to hers, she saw that the confidence they'd been building was gone, replaced by the same fear that had made him run 7 months ago. "I should go," he said. "Don't you dare." Zara's voice was fierce. "Don't you dare let him get in your head. He doesn't know you. He doesn't know us." "But what if?" "No." Zara grabbed his hands, holding them tight. "No what ifs. No fears. No listening to people who want to tear us down because they can't understand what we're building." But even as she said the words, she could see David pulling away from her, emotionally if not physically. Her father had found exactly the right pressure point and pressed until something essential cracked. "I need to think," David said, and the echo of his words from 7 months ago made Zara's chest hollow out. "David, please." But he was already walking away, just like he had before, just like her father had known he would. Zara stood in her doorway, watching the man she loved disappear into the elevator, and realized that some wounds never fully healed. They just waited for the right moment to break open again. For 3 days, silence stretched between them like a chasm. Zara threw herself into nesting with manic intensity, organizing drawers that were already organized, scrubbing baseboards that didn't need scrubbing, assembling and reassembling the baby's mobile until her fingers were raw. Maya found her at 2 a.m. on Saturday night, sitting on the nursery floor surrounded by tiny onuses she was folding and refolding. "Girl, you're scaring me," Maya said, settling down beside her. "When's the last time you ate something that wasn't crackers?" "I'm fine," Zara lied, not looking up from the impossibly small sleepers in her hands. "Just getting ready. The baby could come early, you know. I need to be prepared." "You're prepared. You've been prepared since month 6. Maya gently took the onuses from Zara's hands. "This isn't about baby clothes, is it?" The kindness in her sister's voice cracked something in Zara's chest. "He left again, Maya. Just like you said he would." "Did he, though? Or is he sitting somewhere else torturing himself the same way you're torturing yourself?" Zara finally looked at her sister. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means Jerome called me. David hasn't left his apartment in 3 days. Hasn't eaten, hasn't slept, just sits there staring at that ultrasound picture you said he carries around." Maya's voice was gentle but firm. "That doesn't sound like a man who's running away. That sounds like a man who's drowning." Across town, David was indeed drowning. He sat on his couch in the same clothes he'd worn to Zara's apartment 3 days ago, turning her father's words over in his mind like stones he couldn't stop picking at. The ultrasound photo lay on his coffee table, mocking him with its worn edges and faded promise. What exactly do you bring to this equation besides good intentions? The question had burrowed into his brain like a parasite, feeding on every insecurity he'd ever carried. What did he bring? A high school education and a trade certification. A father who'd abandoned him and a history of running when things got complicated. A shoulder injury that would probably flare up for the rest of his life, limiting how much overtime he could work. Was love enough when you couldn't provide stability? When you couldn't give your child the advantages that other families took for granted? His phone buzzed with another text from Jerome. "Come over. Mom's making dinner." David stared at the message without responding, just like he'd ignored the previous dozen. He couldn't face his family's well-meaning concern right now, couldn't handle another conversation about what he should or shouldn't do. The only person he wanted to talk to was the one person he'd forfeited the right to lean on. Have you ever been paralyzed by the fear that love isn't enough? That wanting something desperately doesn't mean you deserve it? Sometimes our biggest battles are with the voices in our own heads telling us we're not worthy of the happiness we're reaching for. What helps you fight those voices? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. A knock at his door interrupted his spiral. David considered ignoring it, but the knocking persisted, patient but insistent. Zara looked at David, who was following her home like he had that first day at the car dealership, steady and protective and present. She thought about her father's cruel words, about all the people who would never understand what they'd built from the ashes of their mistakes. Better than okay, she typed back. We're going to be a family. 6 weeks later, David held their daughter for the first time in the delivery room of the house they'd bought together, furnished together, prepared together. Amora Martinez Thompson came into the world with her father's eyes and her mother's determined chin, and when she wrapped her tiny fingers around David's thumb, he cried like the man he'd become, one who wasn't afraid of his own emotions, wasn't scared of the depth of his love. She's perfect, he whispered, his voice full of wonder. She's ours, Zara said, exhausted and radiant and completely, utterly happy. And later, when Maya asked if she ever worried that David would leave again, Zara looked at the man who'd spent every night of the past 2 months reading pregnancy books, who'd painted the nursery 3 times to get the color exactly right, who'd held her hand through 16 hours of labor and cried when their daughter took her first breath. No, she said simply. He's not going anywhere. We chose each other, and we keep choosing each other. That's what love looks like when it grows up. So what do you think? Can love really conquer fear? Can people truly change and become the partners they were meant to be? I believe they can, and I think Zara and David's story proves that sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones that have to fight for each other. Share your thoughts below. I love hearing about your own stories of love that refuse to give up. 5 years later, when friends asked how they'd made it work, David and Zara would tell them the truth. Love wasn't enough, but love plus commitment, plus showing up every day, plus choosing each other through fear and joy and the beautiful ordinary moments of building a life together, that was everything. And little Amora, playing in the backyard of the house her father had renovated with his own hands, would grow up knowing that the greatest gift her parents gave her wasn't perfection. It was the knowledge that true love always finds a way to stay.